When Germany signed the armistice in 1918, it did not only lose the war, it lost the framework within which its army had learned how to think. The Treaty of Versailles imposed limits that, in theory, were meant to prevent any return to military power. The Reich was reduced to a professional army of 100,000 men, without compulsory military service, without a formal general staff, without tanks, without combat aviation, and with artillery and armaments under control. That cage, however, forced a rigorous selection process and a doctrinal adaptation that would ultimately turn into an advantage. Instead of a mass army, Germany retained a small, highly trained and politically protected corps that could act as a matrix for expansion once the restrictions were challenged. In the immediate post-war years, the Reichswehr focused on two tasks: maintaining internal order and preserving military knowledge. The experience of the 1914 to 1918 front had left specific lessons. Industrial firepower had made static warfare lethal, tactical surprise had become possible through infiltration and coordination, and victory increasingly depended on synchronizing different weapons in time and space. Under General Hans von Seeckt, the Reichswehr fostered a culture of study and review that was not merely rhetorical. Manuals were written, operations were analyzed in detail, and efforts were made to turn what had been learned into repeatable procedures. With the General Staff prohibited, an equivalent functional structure was maintained under other names, ensuring continuity in planning, training, and operational thinking. The reduced size of the army had a practical effect. Every officer had to deliver more. Careers became competitive, and the institution invested in developing commanders capable of making decisions without waiting for detailed orders. This tradition did not originate in 1939. It came from the Prussian style of mission command, in which the superior defines the objective and the subordinate chooses the method. In a country that could not afford large resources or rapid replacements, the bet was on quality, cadres with judgment, technical discipline, and a shared understanding of how war should be fought. Future German effectiveness was also nourished by a fact uncomfortable for the international order. Germany sought spaces to train and experiment beyond the sight of inspectors. Cooperation with the Soviet Union in the 1920s provided clandestine opportunities for testing and training in restricted areas. Beyond specific details, the central point was structural. While the prohibition aimed to freeze capabilities, the German military apparatus sought to keep innovation and practice alive. This effort did not mean automatic superiority, but it did prevent the loss of complex competencies that other armies would only painfully recover in 1939 to 1941. In parallel, the political context of the Weimar Republic was unstable: economic crisis, polarization, and violence. The Reichswehr became an actor defending its autonomy and seeking institutional survival. This situation reinforced a closed-core mentality with strong internal standards and a high degree of cohesion. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he encountered a military structure that was not Nazi in origin, but eager to free itself from Versailles. The new regime provided something decisive: political will and state resources for large-scale rearmament. From 1933 onward, German policy moved toward war through cumulative steps. First came the reconstruction of military aviation under the Luftwaffe, presented as modernization and national pride. Then followed the return of compulsory military service in 1935 and the expansion of the army beyond the imposed limit. Rearmament was not merely quantitative, it was aimed at creating mobile and coordinated forces. The tank, the radio, and the aircraft were not novelties in themselves, but Germany integrated these tools into a doctrinal system, concentrating force at critical points, breaking through the front, rapidly exploiting penetration, and disorganizing the enemy before it could reconstitute itself. The radio deserves a specific place in this story. The ability to communicate orders and reports while on the move allowed the coordination of mobile units in a way that, in practice, multiplied operational speed. Germany's future effectiveness depended less on genius and more on procedures that linked reconnaissance, decision, and action with less friction. Armored and motorized units, combined with artillery, engineers, and air support, could operate as coherent combat packages. This coherence was not spontaneous. It required training, a common doctrine, planned logistics, and commanders trained to improvise within a clear objective. The regime also promoted a wartime economy in peacetime. The four-year plan, launched in 1936, sought to prepare the country for a prolonged conflict through partial autarky, industrial substitutes, and the expansion of strategic sectors. German military effectiveness was tied to industrial decisions: steel, fuels, explosives, vehicles, munitions. Germany was not self-sufficient in oil and several raw materials, which would later introduce real limits. But the effort to reduce vulnerabilities translated into greater initial capacity to sustain rapid and concentrated campaigns. There was also an organizational component. The German army prioritized realistic training and staff work. Operational planning became a profession. Marches, command exercises, tactical problems, and a culture of evaluation sought to ensure that once combat arrived, execution would be fast and consistent. Within this framework emerged a generation of commanders who, out of professional conviction, leaned toward offensive operations and initiative at all levels. The combination of mission command and modern communications created an advantage in fluid environments. If the enemy reacted late or rigidly, the German system could outflank, isolate, and force local collapses. Between 1936 and 1939, German foreign policy accumulated successes without general war. Remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia after Munich, and the subsequent occupation of the remaining Czech lands. Each episode had a direct military impact. It tested the will of rivals, provided resources, industry, and strategic positions, and fed an internal sense of momentum. The absorption of Czech equipment and factories, for example, increased available industrial capacity and material, reinforcing campaign potential. Poland as a system test. The German-Soviet Pact of 23 August 1939 removed for a few weeks the risk of a two-front war. For the German High Command, this margin was operational. It allowed forces to be concentrated toward the east, assumed that France and the United Kingdom would react with delay, and made it possible to execute a short campaign before the European balance was rearranged. In the days that followed, deployment accelerated. The plan to attack Poland was designed for a rapid victory through converging attacks, a breakthrough of the front, and the destruction of the enemy army before it could withdraw to interior lines. The invasion began on the 1st of September 1939. German effectiveness in this first campaign cannot be explained by a single factor, but by the combination of several mechanisms already being trained: mission-type command, communications, concentration of mobile forces, close air support, and coordination of combined arms. The Wehrmacht was not fully motorized, but it did possess mobile spearheads that acted as instruments of breakthrough. The logic was clear. It was not necessary to motorize the entire army to achieve operational speed. It was enough to motorize what was decisive, use it to open the front, and then envelop. The Luftwaffe played a central role from the outset. Its objective was not merely to bomb in a generic sense, but to intervene in the enemy system. Airfields, railway hubs, communications, command centers, and columns on the move. The attack on Polish aviation, combined with technical and organizational superiority, quickly reduced the capacity for aerial response. Once air superiority was achieved, close support became a force multiplier. Dive bombers and attack aircraft could strike troop concentrations, bridges, crossings, and localized defenses at the exact moment required by the ground maneuver, something difficult to match for armies with less integrated doctrines. On land, the campaign exposed the value of radios and staff practices. Units advanced, detected resistance, requested support, and rapidly adjusted routes. German coordination was not perfect, but it tended to be faster than the Polish system in turning information into movement. The result was a recurring pattern: penetrations that forced withdrawals, withdrawals that turned into dispersion, and dispersion that prevented the re-establishment of a coherent line. In this type of warfare, the side that maintains cohesion and communications usually sets the tempo. Poland, however, was not a passive or unarmed enemy. It had a large army with experience and the will to defend itself, but it faced structural problems: a geography difficult to hold against converging attacks, limitations on full mobilization at the outset, and a strong dependence on railways that became vulnerable when hubs were attacked or cut. Moreover, the Polish command sought to avoid early encirclement while at the same time protecting vital centers, which dispersed forces along a broad front. That dispersion made it easier for the Germans to apply their method, fixing forces in some sectors, breaking through in others, and exploiting toward the rear. The concept of Blitzkrieg would later become popular as a label, but in 1939 what existed was a way of operating, short campaigns that avoided attrition through speed, surprise, and concentration. The German command sought rapid decisions to prevent the war from becoming a repetition of the attritional fighting of 1914 to 1918. That fear was present in military culture. The enemy's command capacity had to be destroyed and forced to lose control of space. Encirclement was an operational obsession because it promised decisive results, capturing troops, not merely pushing them back. During the first weeks, Polish forces attempted to reorganize and carried out local counterattacks. There were significant battles, such as the Battle of the Bzura, where the Poles sought to strike a German flank and relieve the pressure on Warsaw. That offensive showed that the Polish army could maneuver and surprise, but it also highlighted the German advantage in responding: aerial reconnaissance, speed in concentrating forces, and the ability to seal the battle with air and artillery support. As the Luftwaffe dominated the air, any Polish concentration was exposed while moving or in open terrain, forcing operations to be conducted with greater caution and less mass. A key element of German effectiveness was logistical discipline applied to speed. Advancing rapidly is not just about moving tanks, it means sustaining them with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, repaired bridges, cleared routes, and controlled traffic. In 1939, the Wehrmacht already had experience with long marches, coordination of columns, and the combined use of motorized and rail transport. When the spearheads advanced, the supply flow behind them had to be reorganized. Friction existed, but the system was designed to accept that friction and keep pushing by prioritizing what was decisive. This idea of priority was central. Not everything receives the same. What breaks the front receives first. German command structure also played a role. The culture of delegation allowed a unit, if it encountered an obstacle, to seek to bypass it, identify a weak point, or request reinforcements without waiting for detailed instructions. This did not mean an absence of control. It meant a type of control based on objectives. The commander's intent was transmitted clearly and subordinates operated within it. In fast-moving campaigns, this method reduces dead time. By contrast, more rigid systems tend to lose momentum when the situation changes and reports are delayed. On September 3rd, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany, honoring the guarantees given to Poland. For the Germans, this fact was strategic, but it did not change the immediate objective: to finish the campaign before the Western Front became active. In practice, France and the United Kingdom did not immediately launch a large-scale offensive that would have forced the withdrawal of significant forces from the east. That window reinforced the German assumption that the initial time could be exploited to produce fate's accomplice. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. For the Polish command, already under pressure and with compromised lines, this Soviet entry closed off options for withdrawal and deep regrouping. The country found itself trapped between two invaders with material superiority and the ability to maneuver. From that point on, the campaign turned into a series of encirclements, surrenders, evacuations, and isolated engagements, with Warsaw becoming both a symbol and a military objective. The capital was bombed and besieged. Its resistance prolonged the fighting, but isolation and sustained pressure ultimately prevailed. The orderly collapse of a campaign does not equate to instant breakdown. There were Polish units that continued to fight and withdraw, attempting to reach safe areas or cross borders to continue the war from exile. But the German system was designed precisely to prevent this, closing corridors, capturing key nodes, occupying bridges, and controlling crossings. The combination of mobility, aerial reconnaissance, and the ability to seal encirclements reduced the chances of escape with cohesive forces. By October 1939, regular fighting in Poland had essentially ended, and the territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union according to agreements made weeks earlier. With the campaign concluded, the German High Command turned its attention westward, While units were reassigned, divisions reorganized, tactical lessons absorbed, and preparations made for the next move, with the French border quiet and the Western Front still without a decisive offensive. Operational pause and preparation for the strike. After the campaign in Poland, Germany was formally at war with France and the United Kingdom, but without an immediate large-scale clash on the Western Front. Between October 1939 and spring 1940, a period commonly called the Phony War in historiography settled in the West. Patrols, skirmishes, occasional artillery, and constant tension, but no Allied offensive aiming to destroy the core of the German army while it was still reorienting from Poland. This lack of direct pressure was a factor of efficiency by omission. It allowed Germany to regain cohesion, redistribute forces, repair equipment, incorporate replacements, and above all, plan ahead for a campaign meant to avoid a long conflict. The German problem was clear from a strategic standpoint. France and the United Kingdom together possessed the resources to sustain a war of attrition that Germany feared repeating. The German economy remained exposed to maritime blockades and dependence on critical imports, particularly fuel. Therefore, German efficiency had to translate into rapid decisions. The operational response was to defeat France in a short campaign, force the British withdrawal from the continent, and thereby reorder the balance before Allied industry could assert itself over time. In this context, the German army did not merely wait. The pause was a period of work. Reports from Poland were reviewed. Armored unit performance, mechanical failures, coordination with the Luftwaffe, traffic congestion, fuel consumption, and limits of deep command. The Wehrmacht sought to turn every campaign into a school. This method fed efficiency. The system relied not only on an initial idea, but on the capacity to adjust procedures under pressure, standardize what worked, and correct what created friction. The Western Front represented a different challenge. Unlike Poland, France was an enemy with a large army, heavy artillery, fortifications, and a significant industrial apparatus. Moreover, the experience of 1914 to 1918 weighed on both sides. France relied on containment and a type of defensive war that preserved human forces, supported by the Maginot Line and a plan to advance into Belgium if Germany attacked from the north, repeating the 1914 pattern. This French expectation was crucial. It was an operational assumption Germany could exploit if it found a way to break the front without a direct clash with the Maginot. German planning for the West went through several phases. The initial plan was, in a sense, predictable. Germany needed to solve two problems simultaneously: open a path into northern France and avoid a frontal assault on the strongest fortifications. However, a main advance through Belgium could encounter the bulk of deployed Allied armies, producing a mass clash leading to prolonged war. This risk required reconsidering how to achieve a quick decision. Here emerged a characteristic element of German efficiency: flexibility in planning and willingness to adopt a high-risk maneuver if it promised a decisive outcome. The plan that ultimately prevailed aimed to surprise where the enemy considered a massive offensive unlikely. The Ardennes was seen by many French planners as difficult terrain for large armored forces: forests, limited roads, bottlenecks. Germany bet on turning that difficulty into a weapon. If it could cross it quickly and with traffic control, it would achieve an operational surprise effect. That bet was not just a map. It required extremely demanding movement management. Moving armored divisions along narrow routes involves the risk of congestion and air vulnerability. German effectiveness here was linked to column discipline, march control, route prioritization, and coordination with the Luftwaffe to protect advance axes and punish any enemy interdiction attempts. The German system, with its staff culture, was accustomed to planning massive marches and maintaining a movement order that prevented logistical collapse before the first clash. At the same time, Germany also solved the northern flank problem by employing airborne forces and rapid attacks to capture critical points: bridges, airfields, crossings. Integrating parachute and glider units into strategic operations was an operational innovation aimed at accelerating the initial breakthrough. It was not a trick, but a way to seize intact infrastructure before it was destroyed, reducing the time needed for ground forces to expand. In the German concept, the first days were decisive. If the enemy managed to organize a stable defense, the campaign would be prolonged. While plans were being developed, the economy and industry continued preparing the military effort. Germany had produced tanks in significant numbers, but not necessarily superior in individual quality to the heavier French models. The German advantage, broadly speaking, lay in how they were employed and in their coordination with communications. Many German tanks were equipped with radios, allowing target changes, fire concentration, reorganization in combat, and rapid exploitation of gaps. In several armies, radios were less universal or restricted to command vehicles, slowing adaptation in mobile combat. In maneuver wars, that difference can matter more than armor thickness. The Luftwaffe, for its part, prepared for a breakthrough role. Instead of limiting itself to strategic bombing, it focused on supporting the ground offensive, neutralizing artillery, attacking columns, destroying bridges after German passage to prevent counterattacks, and paralyzing communication centers. German effectiveness depended on the enemy not being able to concentrate reserves in time. If France managed to move heavy forces to the breakthrough sector and hold the Meuse, the rapid decision plan would collapse. For that reason, the combination of surprise, speed, and air pressure had to precisely prevent that regrouping. The pause also had a psychological and political component. Hitler, aware of the risk of a long war against maritime powers, sought a quick solution on the continent. But the German military command did not operate solely on political orders. It needed an executable plan. The tension between boldness and feasibility was present. There were debates, adjustments, revisions. The central point is that the German system allowed planning to change significantly even within an authoritarian structure, as long as the outcome promised an operational victory. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, the weather hampered operations. The real window for a decisive offensive shifted to the spring. This delay was used for training and preparation. Exercises were conducted, river crossing procedures refined, engineers coordinated, routes signaled, and communications improved. In a war of movement, the transition from paper to terrain requires repeated practice. A successful crossing of the Meuse, for example, depended on bringing bridges, boats, explosives, smoke, artillery, and air support at precise timings. The Western Campaign and the French collapse. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its offensive against the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The opening served a dual operational purpose: to quickly break the border defenses and at the same time trigger the expected Allied command reflex, which was to advance into Belgium to establish a defensive line there. This Allied movement was part of the German design. The faster French and British forces entered Belgium, the more exposed they would be to an encirclement maneuver from the south. In the north, the Wehrmacht used airborne units and mobile forces to capture critical points and disrupt initial defenses. In the Netherlands, a combination of air attacks, parachute landings, and ground pressure aimed to force a quick decision, reducing the time available for the enemy to react and destroy infrastructure. In Belgium, the offensive encountered significant obstacles, including fortified points and prepared positions, but the main objective was not to fight the decisive battle there. It was to fix the enemy, force it to commit its best forces, and maintain the perception that the main German attack was taking place, as in 1914, through the northern corridor. While that theatre absorbed attention, the central strike advanced through the Ardennes. Movement in this sector was a strict test of march management. Armored and motorized divisions had to traverse terrain with limited routes without collapsing into bottlenecks that would make them vulnerable. Initial success depended on maintaining column discipline, controlling traffic priorities, and sustaining the pace. Surprise largely worked because the Allied command did not expect a concentrated armored mass in that sector, and when it clearly detected it, it was too late to prevent it from reaching the Meuse in combat conditions. Crossing the Meuse at points like Sedan was the critical operational moment. German effectiveness manifested in the integration of combined arms and temporal coordination. The Luftwaffe struck defensive positions and command points, affecting communications and morale, while artillery and smoke supported infantry and engineers advancing to the banks. The goal was not just to cross, but to build a bridgehead strong enough to allow armored units to pass and turn a tactical breach into an operational penetration. Once the crossing was achieved, speed became an absolute priority. The danger was that France and the United Kingdom would concentrate reserves and close the gap before the penetration could expand. Allied reaction was quick in intent, but slow in execution. There were local counterattacks, some intense, but coordination was hindered by the rapid pace of events, communication problems, and German air pressure on routes and concentrations. In a maneuver war, the window for an effective counterattack may be hours, not days. Germany bet that even if the enemy understood the danger, it could not mount a coherent response before the penetration became an irreversible cut. After the crossing, German armoured forces advanced westward with the aim of reaching the English Channel and thereby encircling the Allied armies that had penetrated Belgium. This race to the coast was a classic example of operational exploitation. It was not about winning a frontal battle, but about destroying the enemy's campaign structure by separating its forces from supply lines and command centres. As the Germans advanced, the Allied front disintegrated. Units sent north were threatened from the rear, and retreat routes became congested or came under fire. In this context, the siege occurred, culminating in the British evacuation from Dunkirk. The essential factor for analysing effectiveness is the mechanism, a manoeuvre that, in a few weeks, turned Allied material superiority into a logistical and operational survival problem. The BEF and French units were compressed into a pocket against the sea. Evacuation by sea allowed the rescue of much of the British personnel, but implied abandoning a huge amount of material. For Germany, the result was strategic. It expelled the British force from the continent and left France in a critical situation, with its army divided, exhausted, and losing cohesion. After Dunkirk, the campaign entered its second phase, the direct attack into the French interior. With the north compromised and reserves depleted, France tried to reorganize defenses on new lines, but German speed and sustained pressure made stabilizing the front difficult. The Luftwaffe continued attacking communication nodes and retreating columns. The Wehrmacht sought to repeat the method: penetration, encirclement, capture of crossings, and advancement toward points, forcing the enemy to choose between retreating in disorder or being surrounded. The French collapse was not simply a moral defeat, it was a combination of military and structural factors, a command system that, under pressure, struggled to maintain communications on a mobile front, plans assuming a slower war, and a German campaign that maximized surprise and tempo. German effectiveness in 1940 was largely speed effectiveness, imposing a sequence of decisions on the enemy so fast that each response arrived late or partially. In this type of war, coordination superiority can turn local advantages into strategic results. On June 14th, German forces entered Paris. The French government had already evacuated, and the country faced a political and military crisis. Shortly afterward, an armistice was requested. On June 22, 1940, France signed the armistice with Germany. French territory was divided, with an occupied zone and the establishment of a Vichy government that would administer part of the country under conditions imposed by Germany. For German logic, the central objective was achieved: defeating a major continental power in a short campaign, avoiding the attrition scenario feared by Germany. From continental triumph to latent war of attrition. After the armistice with France on June 22, 1940, Germany found itself in a dominant military position in Western Europe, but without real peace. The United Kingdom remained at war, protected by the sea and sustained by its naval, financial, and industrial capacities. This situation changed the type of effectiveness Germany could exploit. On the continent, the Wehrmacht had demonstrated it could make rapid decisions through maneuver campaigns. Facing an island power, decision-making required other means: air control, maritime pressure, blockade, and, if an invasion was intended, sufficient air-naval superiority to cross the Channel and supply ground forces. German strategy in the second half of 1940 oscillated between two options: forcing the United Kingdom to negotiate through air and submarine pressure, or preparing an invasion, Operation Barbarossa, if the RAF was neutralized and the Channel secured. Within this framework, the Battle of Britain unfolded. To understand German effectiveness here, it is useful to distinguish between tactical operational capability and structural limits. The Luftwaffe was a highly trained instrument, with recent experience in close support, interdiction, and destruction of command systems in ground campaigns. However, its doctrine and aircraft fleet were more oriented toward a short continental war than prolonged strategic bombing against a protected and dispersed industrial economy. Germany did not possess a heavy bomber force comparable to the British or later the Americans, and its ability to sustain attritional air offensives had limitations. In the initial phase, attacks focused on objectives related to air control, airfields, radar stations, command and aircraft production facilities, and maritime routes. The operational goal was to degrade the RAF's interception capability, thereby opening the possibility of an invasion or at least imposing costs leading to negotiation. The British air defence system allowed an efficient response, reducing the decisive effect Germany had achieved in campaigns where the enemy lacked a comparable network. As losses increased, the German calculation became more complex. Each downed aircraft was an asset difficult to replace quickly, and each trained pilot lost represented instruction time that could not be recovered simply by producing aircraft. German effectiveness remained high in terms of tactical execution, wave planning, escorts, coordinated attacks, and route adaptation. But the strategic equation tilted against Germany for two main reasons. First, the United Kingdom could absorb damage without collapsing as a besieged field army. Its center of gravity was not a land front line, but the continuity of its state system and its capacity to sustain the war. Second, Germany failed to achieve sustainable air superiority over southern England, a necessary condition to protect invasion convoys and, by extension, make Seelow viable. The invasion threat worked as political and military pressure, but without the decisive component of air control, it remained at the preparation stage rather than execution. In parallel, the submarine war in the Atlantic began to gain greater relevance. The German submarine weapon offered an indirect path, cutting British supply lines. There were also limits. The Kriegsmarine was inferior to the Royal Navy on the surface and could not impose a traditional naval blockade. Its effectiveness depended on the number of U-boats available, intelligence, and the balance between losses and tonnage sunk. In 1940 to 1941, submarines showed the capacity to inflict serious damage, but there was not yet the volume or comprehensive coverage that would later make the Atlantic campaign particularly critical. Still, for the analysis of German effectiveness, submarine warfare reflects the same logic, seeking decisions with relatively limited means by concentrating on a vulnerable point of the enemy, in this case, maritime traffic. While the war with the United Kingdom continued, Germany consolidated its control over continental Europe. That control was not only military but also economic and logistical. Access to industries, continental raw materials, labor, and railway capacity. Occupation and agreements with aligned states allowed extraction of resources and reorganization of production, though with administrative frictions, local resistance, and coordination problems between agencies. Strictly militarily, the immediate benefit was freeing forces for other campaigns, securing lines of communication in the rear, and creating strategic depth against possible Allied offensives that in 1940 did not materialize. In 1941, the focus shifted to southeastern Europe and the Mediterranean. Italy had entered the war in June 1940 and faced difficulties in several areas, including the campaign in Greece. German intervention in the Balkans responded to operational and strategic needs, stabilizing the flank, securing routes, and preventing the region from becoming a platform for British threats or for interruptions in the supply of critical raw materials. The campaign against Yugoslavia and Greece, launched in April 1941, again showed Germany's capacity to execute rapid operations with coordinated mobile forces, air support, and simultaneous strikes that disrupted defenses. The fall of these countries was relatively swift in campaign terms, although it involved force commitments and later the need for occupation and control with the associated wear and tear. In the Mediterranean, the Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel was sent to support Italy in North Africa. There, German effectiveness took the form of maneuver in a different theatre: long lines, port limitations, and reliance on maritime supply vulnerable to British interdiction. Operations in the desert demonstrated tactical and operational capacity, but also highlighted that local effectiveness did not necessarily translate into strategic decision when supply was fragile and naval control belonged to the enemy. The war in Africa, like the Balkan intervention, consumed resources and attention at a time when Germany was preparing the operation that would define the conflict in Europe, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The decision to attack the USSR combined ideological, economic, and strategic calculations. From a military logic, the central argument was to avoid a long two-front war through a rapid victory in the east. The experience of 1940 reinforced this confidence. If France had collapsed in weeks, it was expected that the Soviet Union, perceived by many German commanders as weakened by purges, command problems, and irregular performance in recent conflicts, could also be defeated through a campaign of encirclement and destruction of the enemy army near the border. Furthermore, the East offered clear economic objectives: grain, minerals, and prospectively access to energy resources whose scarcity limited Germany in a prolonged war. Planning for Barbarossa was organized as a massive operation to annihilate the Soviet army in the Western Zone. The operational concept was consistent with the German way of fighting up to that point: rapid penetrations with armored groups, successive encirclements, destruction of main forces before they could withdraw, and advance toward political and economic centers to prevent reconstitution. To sustain it, armored, motorized, and infantry divisions were concentrated, axes of advance were assigned to large army groups, and air support was prepared to achieve superiority in the first days, attacking airfields, communications, and Soviet concentrations. Barbarossa and efficiency in its purest form. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Germany and its allies launched Operation Barbarossa with a simultaneous attack against the Soviet Union along a front stretching for thousands of kilometers. For the Wehrmacht, the operational goal was to destroy the Red Army in the Western Zone through successive encirclements, preventing it from withdrawing in order and rebuilding a deep defense. The campaign began with the most concentrated expression of the German method of 1939 to 1941: surprise, speed, combined arms, and control of tempo. In the early hours, the Luftwaffe struck airfields, communication centers, and concentrations. The aim was to achieve immediate air superiority to free ground movement and punish any Soviet attempt at reorganization. Surprise was decisive in many sectors. Aircraft destroyed on the ground, disrupted communications, and disorganized local command. This early air advantage allowed German aviation to become direct support for armored groups and a tool of interdiction: attacks on bridges, rail crossings, moving columns, and depots. On the ground, the German deployment was organized into three major army groups: north, center, and south, each with panzer groups as spearheads. The mechanism was repetitive. Infantry fixed the enemy, armored units broke through, armored units advanced into the rear, and then the encirclement closed with forces converging from different axes. The system's effectiveness depended not only on tanks, but on the ability to seal pockets, prevent escape, and destroy encircled forces before the German line stretched too far. In Army Group Center, the combination of mass, experience, and strategic objective made it the most powerful axis at the outset. The region offered favorable terrain for large encirclement maneuvers. In the first weeks, huge pockets formed around Belarus, associated with battles such as Białystok-Minsk, where large Soviet formations were trapped. For Germany, the result of these encirclements was twofold: elimination of enemy troops and opening routes to the interior. In a campaign based on rapid decision-making, each successful encirclement was evidence that Soviet collapse was near. German efficiency was reinforced by an initial doctrinal and organizational difference. The German command system, based on objectives and extended ranges, made it easier for mobile units to adjust advances and exploit opportunities. In contrast, the Red Army suffered severe coordination problems in the initial phase: disrupted communications, confused orders, rigidity at certain levels, and difficulties in timely situation assessment. The result was that many Soviet units became compromised in advanced positions and were overwhelmed before they could withdraw. A disorderly retreat on such a wide front easily turns into dispersion, and dispersion facilitates encirclements. However, even in this phase of operational success, the campaign began to reveal the physical limits of the German method. Distance altered the relationship between speed and supply. Each kilometer gained stretched logistical lines relying on poor roads, worn vehicles, and a railway system requiring adaptation due to gauge changes. The Germans had plans to convert railways, but the scale of the advance and Soviet destruction of infrastructure caused delays. Consequently, the armored spearheads began to rely more on road supply columns, vulnerable to traffic jams, mechanical failures, and localized attacks. The Red Army, moreover, did not collapse. Despite enormous losses and initial disorganization, the Soviet system had territorial depth. the capacity for mass mobilization, and a political willingness to accept extreme costs without negotiation. This introduced a fundamental difference compared to 1940. France had been defeated as a field army and as a state structure in weeks. The Soviet Union could lose entire armies and continue forming others. In terms of German effectiveness, this meant that the method of rapid annihilation needed to work on a gigantic scale, and yet it might not be sufficient if the enemy could replace forces and stabilize fronts. In the north, the Army Group North advanced toward the Baltic states and in the direction of Leningrad. There, the terrain and the presence of forested and swampy areas complicated movement, although initial operational superiority allowed deep advances. The campaign toward Leningrad was conditioned by logistical challenges and the need to hold flanks. As the front extended, the Germans had to allocate forces to protect lines of communication and control captured areas, reducing the mass available for decisive blows. In the south, the Army Group South faced a different scenario: higher density of Soviet forces, wider terrain, and important economic objectives. The struggle for Ukraine was intense, and German effectiveness manifested in encirclement maneuvers, but it also encountered stronger resistance and the problem of coordinating German forces with allies. The presence of Romanian, Hungarian, and other units added mass, but introduced differences in equipment, training, and command capability. In a war based on synchronization, these asymmetries could slow operations or create vulnerabilities in secondary sectors. A key feature of German effectiveness in 1941 was its ability to exploit the Soviet command crisis in the first months. Radios, aerial reconnaissance, the speed of staffs, and the initiative of subordinate commanders allowed encirclements to close before the enemy could understand and react. But as the campaign progressed, the Red Army began to learn under pressure. Structures were reorganized, controls reinforced, new defensive lines established, and measures adopted to reduce the impact of German superiority in maneuver. Time favored the defender in a country of enormous distances. In July and August, the Wehrmacht continued producing large encirclements. The logic was insistent: destroy the Western Soviet armies in series before they could fall back to deeper defensive positions. But the very magnitude of these pockets created a practical problem. Closing an encirclement is not the same as liquidating it. Maintaining thousands of prisoners, reducing resistance pockets, securing routes, and then refocusing mobile forces consumed time and resources. Each successful operation left the attacker deeper in enemy territory, with longer lines and a more worn mobile park. By September 1941, the campaign had advanced hundreds of kilometers. Germany controlled vast areas, had captured or destroyed large Soviet formations, and maintained operational initiative. But the central objective had not materialized. The German High Command faced an operational dilemma that was partly a consequence of its own success. With extended forces and multiple possible objectives, it had to decide where to concentrate the next blow to produce a strategic decision before autumn and logistics eroded speed. Kiev, the turn toward Moscow, and the speed limit. In early September 1941, the German command prioritized a large-scale encirclement operation in Ukraine to eliminate Soviet forces, threatening the southern flank of the Army Group Center's advance and, at the same time, to capture a key economic and logistical area. The result was the siege of Kiev, one of the largest encirclement operations of the campaign. German operational logic remained consistent: use of mobile forces to close the rear, coordination with infantry to seal the pocket, and systematic reduction of the encircled area. Tactical operational success was evident in terms of captured Soviet troops and destroyed equipment, but it came at a temporal and wear and tear cost: weeks consumed, vehicles subjected to long marches, and a reorientation of armored forces that delayed the main blow planned toward Moscow. While Kiev was being liquidated, the northern front continued to close around Leningrad. By September, German and Finnish forces had helped isolate the city by land, cutting most direct routes and establishing a siege which, although not entirely airtight at all times, turned the campaign into a combination of blockade, artillery, and attrition. For Germany, the siege had strategic meaning: immobilize Soviet forces, prevent the use of the port and local industry, and eliminate a political and industrial center without bearing the cost of an immediate urban assault. For the Red Army, the priority was to maintain logistical contact via alternative routes and sustain a defense that avoided total collapse, even under extreme supply conditions. German effectiveness in 1941 had depended on imposing the pace and turning breakthroughs into encirclements. However, time had itself become an operational factor. The distances covered since June had altered the logistics equation: fuel and ammunition supply, engine and transmission maintenance, availability of tires, spare parts and tractors, and adaptation of railways to European gauge became problems that could not be solved by tactical initiative alone. The German system had been designed for rapid campaigns, but not for maintaining armoured spearheads in continuous operation hundreds of kilometres from their bases for months without prolonged rest. After the closure of Kiev, the German command redirected the effort toward the most symbolic and decisive political operational objective: Moscow. By late September, the Army Group Center offensive against the capital, known as Operation Typhoon, was ready. The goal was to destroy Soviet forces defending the western approaches to Moscow through a series of encirclements, open corridors for mobile units, and capture the city before weather and the reorganized Soviet system consolidated a defense in depth. The approach aligned with German doctrine: a rapid decision through enemy command collapse, not gradual attrition. On September 30th, 1941, the offensive toward Moscow began. In its early phases, the Wehrmacht achieved significant advances and major encirclements in the Vyazma and Bryansk regions. The procedure was similar to previous weeks: rapid penetration, deep closures, and destruction of Soviet concentrations. The Luftwaffe supported the offensive by striking routes and nodes, although increasing distance and deteriorating weather began to limit continuity of air operations. These encirclements, in terms of Soviet casualties and prisoners, reinforced the German perception that collapse could be near. But they also faced a recurring problem. Clearing pockets took time, and each passing week brought late autumn closer. On the Soviet side, the response combined defense and mobilization. Unlike June and July, the Red Army had had months to reorganize command structures, rebuild communications, and mobilize reserves. Losses remained enormous, but the Soviet system sustained the capacity to form new units, move industry eastward, and strengthen political military control over the front. The defense of the capital became a strategic priority. Layered defensive lines were established, field fortifications employed, reserve units integrated, and control of terrain along approach axes organized. The Soviet objective was not necessarily to defeat the Wehrmacht in open maneuver, but to slow its pace, force it to deploy, consume fuel, and expose its logistical flank to attrition. In October, weather and terrain began to act as systematic obstacles. The Rasputitsa, a period of mud caused by rain and thaw, degraded unpaved roads and made wheeled and tracked movement slow and costly. In a campaign based on speed, mud not only reduces kilometers per day, it increases fuel consumption, heightens mechanical wear, and disrupts supply schedules. For the Wehrmacht, this meant armored spearheads could advance in certain sectors, but with less overall cohesion and delays that opened windows for the defender to reorganize. As the front approached Moscow, combat began to take on more static characteristics along some axes. The Wehrmacht could still penetrate and outflank positions, but each advance came at the cost of growing losses, fatigue, and unit dispersion. The German system, reliant on fine coordination, began to suffer from accumulated friction. Vehicles immobilized by breakdowns, units arriving late, ammunition not reaching on time, and troops forced to operate with degraded equipment. Meanwhile, the Red Army increased defensive density, employed local counterattacks, and sought to exploit the extension of German flanks, especially where Germany's allies held weaker sectors or where German infantry lagged behind mobile spearheads. In November, with the onset of the harshest cold, mud gave way to hardened ground that facilitated movement in some stretches but introduced other problems: frozen lubricants, startup failures, clothing and medical capacity limitations, and severe human attrition. German preparation for a prolonged winter campaign was insufficient because the original planning assumed a decisive victory before the cold season. German operational effectiveness, still significant at the tactical level, was conditioned by a structural fact: time had broken the short campaign assumption. The Soviet counteroffensive and the erosion of the German method. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched on December 5, 1941, around Moscow, was not an isolated episode, but the operational consequence of several accumulated processes. The Wehrmacht had advanced to the limit of its logistics, had lost part of its tempo superiority due to weather and distance, and faced a Red Army that, despite massive losses, had managed to stabilize command, concentrate reserves, and organize a layered defense. For Germany, the winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the first moment when its efficiency system ceased to produce decisive strategic results and began operating under a logic of survival and containment. The Soviet blow was applied on multiple axes with a clear goal: push the Wehrmacht away from Moscow, disrupt its forward positions, and force it to retreat to more defensible lines. The Soviet offensive combined frontal attacks with strikes on weakened sectors, particularly where German units were overstretched with limited rest, supply issues, and cumulative losses since June. The USSR's ability to launch a winter offensive surprised many German commanders, partly because the German central assumption had been that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Operationally, the surprise here was not only about the timing, but the very existence of sufficient Soviet reserves to sustain continuous attacks. The first effect was psychological and command-related. Since 1939, the Wehrmacht was accustomed to setting the tempo. In December 1941, that tempo changed hands in critical sectors. When an attacker becomes a defender without planning, it suffers additional friction: partially prepared positions, logistical lines stretched forward rather than backward, units deployed to advance rather than resist. The transition required reorganizing units, building defenses, establishing reserves, and improving winter supplies. In many sectors, this transition occurred under pressure, multiplying the risk of local collapse. Tactically, winter introduced harsh conditions for both sides, but particularly affected the attacker relying on mobility and mechanical maintenance. Extreme cold and inadequate equipment for some German troops increased casualties from freezing and illness, reduced combat efficiency, and complicated medical logistics. Materially, vehicle and weapon operations became more demanding. Oils, lubricants, batteries, parts, all were affected by low temperatures. Although frozen ground could ease movement on unpaved routes, the ability to sustain offensive operations decreased if supply was not constant. The Wehrmacht, already worn down by 6 months of campaigning, faced a season for which it had not been prepared. German command responded with a mix of limited withdrawals, regroupings, and rigid resistance at key points. During this period, a pattern consolidated, which would reappear with nuances. German defense became more dependent on strong points and maintaining critical positions to prevent chain collapses. Defense in depth, supported by artillery and local counterattacks, began replacing the momentum of penetration. This did not mean Germany had lost its tactical capability. It meant its operational superiority could no longer be exploited with the same margin of freedom. The Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow forced German withdrawals in various sectors. The Red Army sought to exploit the moment to produce reverse encirclements, isolate salients, cut routes, and destroy retreating units. However, it also faced limits: its own losses, the difficulty of supplying winter offensives, variable quality of some formations, and the challenge of coordinating large-scale attacks. Even so, the strategic balance of the winter was clear. Moscow did not fall, the Wehrmacht did not achieve the sought political decision, and the war in the East turned into a prolonged campaign. An additional factor altered the overall framework. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and a few days later, Germany declared war on the United States. This event expanded the conflict to an industrial and logistical scale that would harm Germany in the long term. On the immediate Eastern Front, the entry of the United States did not change the snow or the distances, but it did change the arithmetic of time. Germany could no longer expect its main enemy to remain isolated or exhausted without increasing external material intervention. The war was heading toward a scenario where global production and transport potential would be central. During the winter and early 1942, the Wehrmacht had to reorganize. Units had lost trained personnel and experienced officers. German effectiveness in 1939 to 1941 depended not only on equipment, but on cadres capable of quick decision-making and precise execution. The erosion of these cadres was a structural problem. Replacing a tank could be a factory matter. Replacing an effective command, no. At the organizational level, Germany began to rely more on emergency measures, rushed reinforcements, reconstitution of divisions with lower average quality, and use of Allied units to cover extensive sectors, freeing German forces for critical points. This need was, in itself, an indicator that the campaign was no longer the sequence of concentrated blows of 1940. Logistics remained the hidden axis of the problem. The distance from Germany and Poland to the Moscow front and beyond required a large-scale functioning railway system. Track conversion, maintenance, security against partisans, and node management became vital. In 1942, partisan warfare in the rear began to weigh more heavily in German calculations, forcing troops to be assigned to security escorts and control operations, reducing the force available for the front. This directly affected effectiveness, because German effectiveness depended on concentration, not dispersion. At the same time, the Red Army improved its institutional learning capacity. The experience of 1941 had been catastrophic, but the Soviet response was to adjust structures, reinforce command discipline, improve artillery coordination, and employ defenses in depth. Industry began relocating inland and producing domestically, with a strategic goal: sustain a long war in which the USSR could absorb losses and still continue fighting. This capacity for continuity was precisely what the German method sought to prevent in 1941, and its emergence consolidated the phase change. By spring 1942, the Wehrmacht had managed to avoid a total collapse on the Central Front, stabilizing lines after retreats. But the cost was a clear loss of sustained strategic initiative. Germany could still plan offensives, still had mobile forces, still could win battles, but no longer had the same margin of tempo superiority that had allowed rapid defeats in Poland and France. The war in the east had turned into a conflict where each offensive would require enormous concentrations, massive logistical consumption, and assuming the enemy could recover, counterattack, and prolong the fight. With the front stabilized after winter, German command began directing its 1942 strategy southward, seeking economic and operational objectives that could compensate for the impossibility of a quick decision in the center. This reorientation set the stage for the campaign toward the Caucasus and the Volga, where Germany would attempt to regain the logic of quick decision through a strike directed at critical resources, with the risk of stretching its lines to the limit again. Why it worked? The pillars of German effectiveness. Before the collapse, the partial stabilization of the front after the winter of 1941 to 1942 left Germany in a different situation than during the first months of Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht had avoided a general collapse in the central sector but could no longer sustain continuous offensives at the same pace and operational freedom as in 1939 to 1941. In the spring of 1942, the German High Command oriented its planning toward a concentrated campaign in the south, seeking economic and operational objectives to compensate for the failure of the strategic decision in Moscow. That choice, which would culminate in the planning of the summer offensive called Fall Blau, was the point at which German effectiveness was forced to select where it could remain effective, because it could no longer be so across the entire front at the same time. This shift reveals, by contrast, what had been the real pillars of German effectiveness in the previous phase. The first was doctrinal. The Wehrmacht did not seek to push the enemy back, but to destroy its command and combat capacity through encirclements. In Poland and France, this logic worked almost perfectly because the enemy system had neither the time nor the depth to absorb successive blows. In the Soviet Union, it worked on the operational level for weeks and months, producing enormous pockets. But the enemy retained territorial depth, massive mobilization, and a state apparatus willing to sustain losses without negotiation. There, the German method remained effective as a campaign technique, but was no longer sufficient as a short war strategy. The second pillar was organizational, mission command and initiative culture. On a mobile front, the difference between an army that waits for detailed orders and one that acts with clear objectives is measured in hours. The Wehrmacht, since the Reichswehr, had invested in training commands capable of deciding under uncertainty and sustaining the advance even when the initial plan warped. This allowed exploiting local opportunities and converting them into operational results before the enemy could reconstitute itself. In 1940, this quality translated into the ability to sustain the race to the Channel and seal the northern encirclement. In 1941, it enabled closing pockets at a pace the Red Army in the initial phase could not match. The third pillar was technical procedural, communications and coordination. Extended radio in armored and command units turned mobile groups into instruments of control, not just speed. The average German tank did not need to be the heaviest to be decisive if it could receive orders, correct direction, concentrate fire, and reorganize while moving. This advantage was amplified by staffs trained in march planning, traffic control, and route management. The German method relied on repeatable procedures: how to cross rivers under fire, how to integrate engineers, how to coordinate with air support, how to close a deep encirclement, how to redistribute fuel and ammunition to the decisive tip. This standardization reduced friction and allowed sustaining pace. The fourth pillar was integration with the Luftwaffe as an operational instrument. In 1939 to 1941, German aviation was effective not because of general bombing, but for concrete functions: early air superiority, route interdiction, node destruction, and close support that punished concentrations and point defenses when the ground maneuver required it. This coordination was especially potent against armies that relied on railroads and roads to move reserves. In France, it helped prevent a coherent response in the breakthrough sector. In 1941, it amplified the surprise effect and accelerated the collapse of Soviet communications in the initial phase. The fifth pillar was rhythm as a weapon. Germany did not just attack, it attacked by imposing sequences that forced the enemy to decide late. German effectiveness was largely calendar effectiveness, turning time into an offensive resource. In Poland, advance speed cut lines before mobilization and retreat stabilized. In France, the Meuse breakthrough and the race to the Channel disarmed the Allied defense plan in Belgium. In Barbarossa, the initial pace allowed encircling advanced Soviet forces before they could withdraw to interior lines. In all cases, the enemy was forced to improvise under pressure, and improvisation, without communications and without ready reserves, tends to fragment armies. This set of factors explains why Germany was so effective in the rising phase. It also explains why that effectiveness began to erode when the operational environment changed. From the fall of 1941, pace was no longer an unlimited resource and became constrained by distance, climate, and attrition. Logistics, which had previously accompanied the decisive spearhead, began to break down due to extension. Rail conversion, road conditions, fuel consumption, vehicle wear, and the need to protect the rear against partisans transformed the equation. To maintain a mobile strike, resources had to be dispersed to support it, and this dispersion reduced the concentration that made the method effective. In the spring of 1942, Germany attempted to regain favorable conditions by choosing a target where the campaign method could work again: the Soviet South, promising both to capture energy resources and to force the Red Army to defend large spaces. German planning sought to concentrate mobile forces in one sector, repeat the breakthrough exploitation encirclement logic, and turn an operational victory into a strategic advantage that compensated for the 1941 failure. This approach involved front reorganization, reinforcing units for a summer offensive, redistributing fuel, ammunition, and vehicles, and assigning staggered objectives along the Don, Volga, and Caucasus axes. At the same time, the Red Army was no longer the one of June 1941. Although it still suffered enormous losses, it had regained some coherence. Improved command discipline, reinforced echelon defenses, increased use of artillery, and learned to absorb initial blows without collapsing immediately. The USSR had also begun to stabilize internal production after industrial relocations, which would affect the balance of forces in the medium term. In this scenario, German effectiveness could no longer rely on the assumption that the enemy would collapse after a series of encirclements. It had to produce strategic results in a long war context where each advance cost more and yielded less. In June 1942, with dry terrain and regrouped units, German command launched the summer offensive on the southern front, seeking to restore pace and turn local concentration into a strategic decision before the enemy could recombine reserves. Operation Blue began on June 28, 1942, with the German advance on the Don sector. In its early phases, the offensive showed that the Wehrmacht still retained operational execution capability. Armored and motorized units could penetrate rapidly. The Luftwaffe could still support with interdiction and strikes on concentrations and crossings, and German command continued to prioritize maneuver over frontal erosion. Effectiveness at this stage was not about advancing a lot, but breaking Soviet defensive coherence and forcing disorderly retreats. The underlying problem was that the Red Army, unlike the previous summer, was no longer deployed with the same initial vulnerability, and its command tended to accept tactical withdrawals with the priority of preserving the ability to rebuild rear lines. Stalin's men were advancing relentlessly, and the war logic proposed by Hitler, so effective at the start of World War II, would lose its luster until it faded in the face of the Red Army's advance.